In recent decades, China's armed forces have changed beyond recognition. The country still fields the largest standing army on the planet, and many rankings now place it as the third most powerful military in the world, armed with an ever-growing array of advanced weapons. Yet behind this impressive image may lurk a vulnerability that Beijing would rather keep hidden. Lessons from the war in Ukraine, combined with historical experience, suggest that China's real military strength may be far less solid than it appears. In this video, we will explore why the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, might be closer to an origami dragon than to an unstoppable war machine. On the surface, however, the PLA looks like it is on a winning streak. At the lavish military parade on September 3rd, 2025, held to mark the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, the PLA rolled out its newest military technologies, strategic deterrent systems, and cutting-edge combat platforms. For the first time, China publicly displayed its full nuclear triad. Columns of DF-series intercontinental ballistic missiles, including the DF-5C, DF-61, and DF-31BJ, rumbled past, each advertised as having a range of more than 12,400 miles and carrying up to 10 independently targetable re-entry vehicle warheads. Beside them, the JL-3 submarine-launched ballistic missile, the newly revealed JL-1 air-launched nuclear missile, and the new road-mobile DF-61 ICBM made their debut on Chang'an Avenue in Tiananmen Square. The parade also showcased 4 brand-new hypersonic anti-ship missiles, the YJ-15, YJ-17, YJ-19, and YJ-20, each described as carrying hypersonic glide vehicles with highly agile flight profiles designed to deliver precision strikes against high-value targets such as aircraft carriers. China also revealed the LY-1 laser weapon, mounted on an HZ-155 armored truck, together with high-energy laser systems and high-power microwave weapons intended to form a layered shield against drones and incoming missiles. Overhead, 5 different models of 5th-generation stealth fighters, the J-20, J-20A, J-20S, J-35A, and the PLA Navy's J-35, flew in formation for the first time, signaling that China's stealth air fleet is both growing and diversifying. Under the waves, large torpedo-shaped unmanned underwater vehicles, such as the AJX-002, were presented as a glimpse of the future of undersea warfare, especially if they can be produced and deployed at scale. On land, China unveiled its new Type 104th generation main battle tank, boasting an unmanned turret, active protection systems, augmented reality tools for the crew, and advanced radar. Taken together, the spectacle of China's new hardware was, in the words of President Donald Trump, very, very impressive. There's only one crucial question. How can anyone be sure that all of this hardware actually performs as advertised? Every military and every arms manufacturer has powerful incentives to exaggerate the strengths of their equipment. For companies, hyping capabilities while glossing over weaknesses is simply basic marketing. For governments, talking up the lethality of their weapons is also a tool of deterrence. The more terrifying and destructive your arsenal seems to potential adversaries, the less likely they are to confront you directly. Russia has played this game openly during its war in Ukraine. After a single, still murky demonstration of the Oreshnik missile system, the Kremlin launched a propaganda campaign, bragging that it could deliver damage on the scale of a nuclear strike without any radioactive fallout. Officials later claimed that Oreshnik had entered serial production and was being deployed both inside Russia and in Belarus. Yet there is no solid evidence that Oreshnik truly operates as advertised, or that it has actually been fielded in meaningful numbers. What those claims do achieve, however, is to make Ukraine's Western supporters hesitate before supplying more powerful weapons that might be used to hit large strategic targets deep inside Russian territory. The subsequent testing of the nuclear-powered, nuclear-capable Burevestnik missile and the Poseidon stealth underwater drone torpedo serves a similar purpose. If these systems genuinely work as described, they would fundamentally reshape the global balance of power. A Poseidon drone parked off the coast of San Francisco could be detonated without warning, creating a radioactive tsunami capable of devastating the entire Bay Area. A Burevestnik missile, in theory, could loiter in the atmosphere far beyond the reach of air defenses and then dive at hypersonic speeds to strike any target on Earth within minutes. The message is simple: do not push us, or we will unleash apocalyptic weapons. But what if this is largely bluff? It would hardly be the first time Russia has exaggerated or outright fabricated so-called superweapons. In fact, during the 1950s and 1960s, inventing miracle weapons and inflating their capabilities was practically standard operating procedure for the Soviet Union. Like modern China, the Soviets loved huge military parades designed to project overwhelming strength, a tradition that continues today in the Russian Federation. At a massive parade in 1965, marking the 20th anniversary of victory in the Second World War, Gigantic GR-1 global missiles, supposedly able to strike anywhere on the planet, were solemnly towed across Red Square by tractors. Soviet radio announcers, reading from prepared scripts, proclaimed that the parade of mighty defensive missiles was ending, that their maintenance was fully automated, and that there were no limits to what these weapons could do. The enormous missiles dominated headlines around the world and alarmed Western military analysts and ordinary citizens alike. In reality, the entire display was a sham. The missiles on parade were not real weapons at all, but empty shells representing a system that did not exist in operational form. This was later revealed by Vladimir Semishastny, a former KGB chairman, and one of the key figures behind the removal of Nikita Khrushchev in his memoirs. And it was not a one-off trick. As Semishastny explained, the Soviet Union routinely announced once, twice, or even 3 times a year that it had mastered some new missile technology. At the next parade, the supposed wonder weapon would be shown on Red Square, and only a tiny inner circle knew that many of these missiles were mere mock-ups, a Potemkin village made of steel and paint with no ability to fly. Why go to such elaborate lengths? According to Semishastny, the answer lay in the limited surveillance technology of the era. Western intelligence agencies had a very hard time assessing the real state of the Soviet arsenal because everything of value was hidden in underground silos and hangars. The only time foreign observers could see Soviet weapons up close was during parades. Knowing that their adversaries could not easily verify which systems were real and which were fake, Soviet leaders deliberately set out to mislead them. Khrushchev had begun boasting about the GR-1 global missile 3 years before the parade, claiming that it had no American equivalent. Possessing such a weapon, he said, made all other nuclear deterrents obsolete because a global missile supposedly could not be detected in time for any defensive measures. In truth, when Khrushchev gave that speech, the design bureau had not even drafted a research proposal, let alone built a prototype. The missile existed only on paper and in the imagination. The ruse still worked. NATO intelligence pored over any scraps of information they could find, assigning the GR-1 the codename SSX-10 Scrag. When a prototype missile appeared on Red Square in 1965, analysts in the West were convinced that the Soviets had succeeded. The deception continued even after the parade. The replica missiles were sometimes loaded onto trains at Moscow rail stations in full view of foreign embassy staff, who would then try to deduce where the new weapon was being deployed. Soviet intelligence listened in on the calls of military attachés and monitored their travel plans, using their reactions to measure which tricks had been effective. In the end, the GR-1 was cancelled after repeated test failures and never entered production, but it was far from the only phantom weapon. Similar tactics were used with the intimidating 59-foot self-propelled RT-15 and RT-20 missiles, which looked formidable on parade but failed during trials and were never added to the Soviet arsenal. The gigantic tracked 2B-1 heavy artillery system, nicknamed Oka, was another example. On paper, it could fire a shell 30 miles, but in practice, the recoil was so extreme that it damaged the engine and transmission, and the tracks had to be replaced roughly every 12 miles because of the gun's enormous weight. 6 Oka vehicles proudly rolled across Red Square in 1961, only to be quietly scrapped a few months later. At the 1954 parade, the M4 bomber was unveiled as a nuclear-capable aircraft that could supposedly take off from ice fields in the Chukotka region, close to the United States, with a nuclear payload on board. Following a string of setbacks, however, it was quietly relegated to use as an in-flight refueling tanker. With tricks like these embedded in the Soviet military culture for decades, it would be naive to think that today's Russian leadership is not using similar methods with systems like Oreshnik, Burevestnik, and Poseidon, at least to some degree. The strategic logic is identical. Make NATO hesitate to escalate in Ukraine. This raises an uncomfortable question. Could China be doing something similar? Thanks to the United States' pervasive satellite coverage, signals intelligence, and cyber capabilities, it is far more difficult today for either Russia or China to conceal genuine weapons programs than it was in the 1990s-60s, even if the PLA never released a single video or press statement about its test launches. American sensors would still track much of what is happening almost in real time. Yet an important fact remains. Unlike the United States, whose most advanced weapon systems have repeatedly been tested and refined in actual combat, very few of China's supposed superweapons have ever been used on a real battlefield. China's last major war was its conflict with Vietnam, and the final border clashes related to that war fizzled out in 1979. That means neither China nor the United States has any concrete data on how China's modern missiles, drones, tanks, stealth aircraft, laser weapons, and other systems would perform under the brutal conditions of high-intensity warfare. From a deterrent standpoint, it is clearly in Beijing's interest to convince Washington that these systems are far more capable than they might be in practice. Just as the Soviets did, China may find it useful to roll out impressive-looking hardware at grand parades that, if scrutinized closely, might to some extent turn out to be the equivalent of balsa wood displays, not unlike the showpiece high-rise towers in China's famous empty cities. However, there is another powerful reason to question the true effectiveness of China's military, and it has less to do with engineering than with human behavior: entrenched corruption. Once again, the war in Ukraine offers a revealing case study. It is beyond dispute that corruption has badly undermined the fighting capacity of both the Russian and Ukrainian militaries. As one headline on a global security website bluntly put it, Ukraine's reputation for corruption is legendary. On the latest Corruption Perceptions Index from Transparency International, Ukraine is tied for third most corrupt country in Europe, on the same level as Serbia, and ranking ahead of Belarus and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Even so, with a score of 35, Ukraine still scores about 60% higher than Russia, whose score of 22 places it alongside Lebanon and only marginally above Zimbabwe. Since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the Russian military has been plagued by corruption scandals that have exposed deep structural problems in its leadership and procurement systems and risked derailing the war effort. The situation grew so dire that President Vladimir Putin launched a sweeping purge of the defense establishment in 2024, a process that continues today. In April 2024, Deputy Defense Minister Timur Ivanov was the first major figure brought down, accused of taking bribes and funding an extravagant lifestyle through corrupt deals. Shortly after, Lieutenant General Yuri Kuznetsov, who headed the Defense Ministry's personnel department, was detained for allegedly selling state security clearances. In May, Major General Ivan Popov, the former commander of the 58th Army, was arrested in connection with a large-scale fraud case. Around the same time, Lieutenant General Vadim Shamarin, Deputy Chief of the General Staff and head of the main Communications Directorate, was charged with accepting at least $400,000 in bribes in exchange for steering state contracts to a communications firm. Vladimir Verteletsky, a senior official in the Defense Procurement Department, was likewise arrested and accused of abusing his position by approving incomplete work on a defense order, causing losses of more than $773,000. Army General Dmitry Bulgakov, a former Deputy Minister of Defense, was implicated in supplying low-quality rations to Russian troops. And in July 2024, Andrei Belkov, the head of a major military construction company, was detained over alleged abuse of contracts for defense infrastructure. Although arrests are ongoing, no one can say how much real impact they are having, especially when some estimates place the total amount embezzled at as much as $121 billion. Ukraine, for its part, has also faced serious corruption scandals, particularly in 2025. Since January, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, or NABU, has been investigating Defense Minister Rustem Umerov for possible abuse of power. The investigation focuses on his decision to overturn a unanimous vote by the Supervisory Board that would have renewed the contract of Defense Procurement Agency head Marina Bezrukova. Instead, he replaced her with his ally Arsen Zumadilov and removed two board members who were not aligned with him. In July 2025, a wave of anti-corruption protests spread across Ukraine after the Verkhovna Rada, Ukraine's parliament, passed Bill number 12,414. That law stripped NABU and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, or SAPO, of their independence and granted broader powers to Prosecutor General Ruslan Kravchenko, a close ally of President Volodymyr Zelensky. Demonstrations erupted the same day in Kyiv, Odessa, Lviv, Dnipro, and other cities, marking the first large-scale anti-government protests since the full-scale invasion began in 2022. Despite the widespread backlash, Zelensky signed the law, arguing that the changes were needed to remove Russian influence from the anti-corruption agencies. In response to the protests and to sharp criticism from figures such as EU Enlargement Commissioner Marta Kos, the Rada then passed another law, Bill number 13,533, which essentially reversed the earlier changes. Soon after, NABU launched what may be the largest single corruption investigation since the war started. The case centers on Firepoint, a Ukrainian defense firm that produces drones and the Flamingo cruise missile, as well as businessman Timur Mindich, a co-owner of Zelensky's Kvartal 95 entertainment studio. The investigation, begun in August 2025, is probing whether Firepoint inflated prices and misreported the number of drones delivered under government contracts, potentially benefiting from political favoritism, despite ongoing doubts about the effectiveness of its drones against Russian air defenses. Firepoint has become one of the top recipients of Defense Ministry funding for drone production, receiving around one-third of the $1.04 billion Ukraine spent on drones in 2024. Based on more than 1,000 hours of surveillance, investigators uncovered a kickback scheme in which contractors allegedly paid a 10 to 15% cut, nicknamed Schlagbaum. Former drone unit commander Major Yuri Kasyanov has also claimed that Firepoint won contracts despite serious design flaws, while more capable systems produced by less connected companies, such as Spear Drone, were ignored. In both Russia and Ukraine, corruption has directly undermined military performance. When money is siphoned off, projects blow past their budgets or collapse before completion. Equipment that appears on procurement lists never actually reaches frontline units because payments are stolen. Cheap components are substituted for quality parts, meaning that weapons fail in combat. The list of distortions goes on. China's overall corruption perceptions index score of 39 suggests that it is significantly less corrupt than Ukraine and almost 4 times less corrupt than Russia at the national level. Yet when it comes specifically to the PLA, corruption may be more deeply rooted than in Russia and Ukraine combined. The situation has become so severe that President Xi Jinping has launched an anti-corruption campaign that makes Putin's purge look modest by comparison. In September 2025, the PLA rocket force announced it was terminating nearly 200 partnerships with suppliers and bid evaluation experts after a corruption probe that had dragged on for 9 years. Investigators uncovered schemes involving collusive bidding, falsified documents, biased scoring in tenders, and forged credentials. This came on the heels of a wider campaign triggered by the 2024 dismissal of former Defense Minister General Li Shangfu and the removal of 2 rocket force commanders. Li and his predecessor, former Defense Minister Wei Fenghe, have both been formally accused of taking bribes and sabotaging weapons production through corrupt practices. They are far from alone. Since 2024, a large number of senior officers and defense industry executives have been swept up in Xi's campaign. The Central Commission for Discipline Inspection has extended its reach beyond the uniformed services into the Central Military Commission, or CMC, China's highest military body. In November 2024, the arrest of Admiral Miao Hua, a longtime Xi loyalist and CMC member, shocked the entire PLA hierarchy. Over the past 2 years, the authorities have also prosecuted numerous defense industry officials for corruption, illegal outsourcing, and the use of defective low-grade components in critical systems. Hu Wenming, the chief architect of China's high-profile aircraft carrier program, was arrested on charges that included bribery, violating party discipline, and even engaging in superstitious practices. Liu Shikuan, head of North China Industry Corporation, was detained alongside Wu Yangsheng and Wang Changqing, top figures at CASC and CASIC, China's largest missile manufacturers. In addition, allegations have surfaced that roughly $16 billion in research and development funds for fighter jet engines were misused or stolen, which helps explain the widely discussed shortcomings of Chinese jet engines. Despite the crackdown, many analysts argue that the damage is already too great. They believe that corruption has weakened China's military from within to such a degree that many of its highly publicized superweapons may not perform anywhere close to their advertised capabilities. A major driver of corruption in the PLA is its promotion system, in which political and ideological loyalty often outweighs competence and technical expertise, because there are no clear, objective criteria for measuring a candidate's political reliability. Promotions are largely discretionary. This encourages the formation of patronage networks in which senior officers build circles of junior officers who owe their careers to them. Such deeply embedded corruption is extremely hard to eradicate, especially when tens of billions of dollars in procurement funds circulate through the system within easy reach. Combined with bureaucratic chaos and limited experience in operating advanced technology under real combat conditions, these problems cast serious doubt on the PLA's actual warfighting effectiveness. Some experts, including analysts at the Observer Research Foundation, suggest that Xi's hesitation to invade Taiwan or to use China's military power more aggressively in the region stems from his fear that these untested superweapons might fail spectacularly in battle. If that is true, then, much like the old Soviet Union, a deeply corrupt PLA would have every incentive to parade its most impressive systems in order to project an illusion of strength, even if those systems might fall apart in a real conflict. It is tempting to put all of this together and conclude that China's military is nothing more than a paper tiger, or, in our metaphor, an origami dragon. That conclusion, however, would be risky. Overestimating an enemy can certainly be costly, leading to excessive caution and unnecessarily prolonged conflict, and many argue that the West has been too timid at times in Ukraine for exactly that reason. But underestimating an opponent is usually not just costly, it can be deadly. Both Napoleon Bonaparte and Adolf Hitler dismissed Russia as weaker than it truly was and ended up with Russian soldiers marching through Paris and Berlin. China has already shown that it is capable of world-class feats in bridge construction, high-speed rail, nanotechnology, robotics, and many other fields, all achieved despite the presence of corruption in those industries as well. Assuming that none of that technological and managerial capability has been transferred into the military realm would be arrogance of the highest order, until China's most advanced weapons have either proved themselves ineffective or shown their true power in combat. It would be reckless to assume they are harmless. We will keep following the evidence as new information emerges, so make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so that you do not miss any of our future updates. Thank you for watching.